Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Taxsutra's ALP Summit 2016, our first transfer pricing summit being held in Mumbai. I'm joined by senior Deloitte partner Sameer Gandhi here, and we have a very special guest, a big name in the world of international tax, none other than the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs at the US Treasury. You would have guessed the name by now, Mr. Robert Stack. Thanks so much, sir, for joining us to deliver the keynote address for the inaugural ALP Summit. We're really grateful that you could take out the time and share your views, your expertise and your insights on how the post-BEPS world is going to look like. And we have over 200 corporate tax heads and CFOs who are going to hear you right now in Mumbai. A quick introduction of Mr. Stack, though he does not need one, but yet he is responsible on behalf of the Assistant Secretary for the conduct of legal and economic aspects of tax policy related to the representation of the United States in bilateral and multilateral relations with other countries, as well as advising the legal and economic staff within the Office of Tax Policy, other offices of the Treasury Department and other government agencies as to the policy analysis and interpretation for domestic legislation. Mr. Stack also serves very importantly as the US delegate to the Committee on Fiscal Affairs in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is the OECD. In addition, Mr. Stack oversees the Office of Tax Policy's participation in the various working bodies of the CFA and sits on the CFA Bureau. He also serves as the US delegate to the Global Forum on Transparency, and prior to joining Treasury, Mr. Stack served as the head of the International Tax Practice Group at the law firm of Irons, Phillips and Barker. In the private sector, he has over 26 years of experience in international tax matters, representing both corporations and individuals. We are absolutely delighted. It's a pleasure, Mr. Stack, to be hearing from you. Without any more ado, I hand it over to you. And of course, once we hear you, we'll also have some questions from Sameer and me in a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak today at the Taxsutra ALP Summit 2016. I eagerly accepted this invitation to address the summit because while a lot remains to be done, there is much to celebrate with respect to India's forward momentum in making India a destination for global investment. The United States has noticed, and more importantly, American investors have noticed. President Obama has called India one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama have all visited India, underscoring the increasing importance of this bilateral relationship, one that is rooted in common values, including the rule of law, respect for diversity, and democratic government. Our bilateral trade has grown from $19 billion in 2000 to over $100 billion in 2014. U.S. exports to India totaled $38 billion in that year, and cumulative foreign direct investment into India totaled while Indian foreign direct investment in the United States totaled $7.8 billion. According to the U.S.-India Business Council, its American investors will invest $27 billion in India in 2016, beyond the $15 billion invested since Prime Minister Modi assumed office. Both the US and Indian governments are keenly focused on nurturing this important relationship. In 2010, the US and India launched the US-India Economic and Financial Partnership, a forum specifically devoted to discussion of economic issues between the two countries. And in January 2015, President Obama and Prime Minister Modi established the first ever US-India Strategic and Commercial Dialogue, an annual forum for broader policy discussions between the United States government and the government of India. I have been honored to have played a role in this increased bilateral engagement, twice visiting Delhi, once to welcome Akhilesh Ranjan into his new role in 2013, and once with U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew as part of the Treasury Ministry of Finance Economic and Financial Partnership meetings. These visits have increased my understanding of the Indian perspective on the U.S.-India tax relationship and I am deeply grateful for the hospitality shown and the willingness of Indian officials to engage constructively on these issues. Given this involvement, I thought today I might share a U.S. perspective on U.S.-India tax issues, as well as the broader BEPS landscape facing us. I want to begin by noting the important and often constructive role played by India in the G20 OECD BEPS project. To say India played an important and constructive role does not, of course, mean that we always agreed. But it does mean that India had sent its finest public servants to conduct this work to represent India's interests in an atmosphere of mutual respect and constructive engagement. In practical terms, it meant that Mr. Ranjan and I, as members of the so-called Bureau Plus of the BEPS project, sat regularly in the same room discussing the BEPS challenges and working towards the important consensus that was necessary to make the BEPS deliverables a reality in 2015. India played an important role in helping to achieve consensus on country-by-country reporting. And while India has always been clear that it could not endorse mandatory binding arbitration in tax treaties, it was and will remain a key player in building the next necessary consensus for improvement to the mutual agreement procedure process. This work continues through the MAP Forum of the Forum on Tax Administration. Indian delegates to the working groups at the OECD, including the Digital Economy Task Force, which I co-chaired with Edward Marcus of France, presented India's interests honestly and forcefully and brought the much-needed Indian perspective to important issues. US and India were also able to negotiate and sign a reciprocal intergovernmental agreement to implement the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, pursuant to which both countries will collect and exchange information about the financial accounts of their respective tax residents in each country. FATCA has now been globalized in the form of the Common Reporting Standard, and countries around the world, including India, will have an important new tool to combat tax evasion. The U.S. has work to do to make the U.S.-India exchanges fully reciprocal, and President Obama has included such provisions in his budget, and they await congressional action. Finally, the recent announcement by the U.S. and India that they will begin accepting applications for bilateral APAs is an achievement that seemed unimaginable a short time ago. Beyond these bilateral successes, India has been making progress on many other fronts that investors notice, and the world is taking notice as well. To note just a few, we can point to India's success in moving up 12 places in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, the government's decision to move away from retroactive laws as a tax policy tool, the manner in which the MAT controversy was resolved, as well as the resolution itself, the decision of the government to revisit areas of tax administration, including the manner in which tax assessors are evaluated. Plainly, India has come to see that it is in its interest to move away from revenue targets as the chief driver of tax administration up and down the bureaucracy. And that is a critical advance. In order to create greater certainty and predictability for investors, the Revenue is issuing more circulars to answer important policy questions on a broad scale, as opposed to leaving them to individual tax assessors. In the last 2 years, the CBDT has stepped in on many occasions to clarify the legal position, to give certainty on complex issues ranging from clarifying withholding obligations to only apply to net income, and recently on the MAT controversy. Specifically in the area of transfer pricing, the Finance Ministry announced it would allow for the use of multiple-year data and ranges of comparable prices. In accordance with international best practices in the area of country-by-country reporting, the Indian Revenue has made clear that it will adopt special procedures to ensure that India can live up to its commitment to use the information for high-level risk assessment and not as a backdoor to formulary apportionment. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not point to the painstaking and groundbreaking work of Partho Shome in connection with all manner of issues connected to improving tax administration in India. These are all examples of a government that is keenly aware of the link between growing the Indian economy and certainty and predictability that investors need to make those investments. Does the above list demonstrate that everything is fine on the Indian tax front? No. While the US-India framework for the resolution of MAP cases has proven effective, there remain tough cases outside the framework that will need a principled resolution. And in connection with MAP, I am happy to announce that the US team will travel to Delhi for more MAP meetings beginning on April 4th. While the Indian judiciary receives highest marks for principled decision-making, internal administrative processes need to provide realistic opportunities for meaningful appeals. And changing the culture from protecting the revenue to applying the law in a fair, principled manner up and down the chain still needs attention. And while being 130th out of 189 countries on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index is indeed an improvement, it is not at all where India needs to be to achieve the sort of growth it needs for its growing population. And investors need fewer surprises, such as the new 7% tariff on imported medical equipment. And while India today cannot see the benefits of mandatory binding arbitration as part of MAP, I am willing to wager that it will get there sooner than anyone in this room might predict today. Why? Because once India is able to increase the resources in and strengthen its tax administration, it will come to appreciate the payoff in terms of increased certainty and the related foreign direct investment that comes with it. But first, the rest of the world needs to embrace arbitration and demonstrate convincingly that it can be a critical element of dispute resolution and of improving tax administration. So is everything great on the tax front for investors coming into India? Well, far from it. Is India on a positive path? Absolutely. I have now been in government long enough to appreciate that getting things done in both of our boisterous democracies is not easy, and so it is important to shine a light on the achievements to date to encourage those taking our countries on a positive path. Turning to BEPS, we turn to an exciting new phase, implementation and monitoring. A key aspect of our ongoing work is broadening the net of participating countries in the BEPS process. In that regard, the G20 finance ministers recently endorsed the inclusive framework that will permit non-G20, non-OECD countries committed to the BEPS deliverables to join the ongoing work. This is an important step to bring all countries around the world around the table to work on these pressing issues. Turning to the specific BEPS action items, among the most important deliverables is the requirement for country reporting. India is in the process of enacting its legislation, and the US issued proposed regulations that will result in approximately 1,800 U.S. multinationals providing country-by-country information to the IRS, which in turn will exchange it with our treaty and TIA partners, including India. Just last week, we announced that we fully expect to finalize those regulations by this June, so that U.S. multinationals with tax years beginning on or after July 1, 2016, will be required to file their country-by-country information with their tax returns. In addition to providing a risk assessment tool, I believe that companies will restructure to avoid having outsized profits in tax havens, and that is a good thing. The work on transfer pricing focused on clarifying the arm's length standard with respect to important issues such as the allocation of risk in a multinational group and the rules with respect to hard-to-value intangibles. In our work on BEPS, the U.S. has been a staunch supporter of a clear articulation of the arm's length standard and for the need to respect contracts when they are consistent with the economic arrangement of the parties, as well as to respect the separateness of legal entities. We did not take this position because the arm's length standard is a perfect tool. We took this position because the proposed alternatives are all worse and undercut the certainty and clarity that is needed for global trade to thrive. But those who would continue to apply the arm's length standard in ways that capitalize on the mobility of capital and intangible property to shift income into low and no tax jurisdictions must appreciate that they are hastening the demise of the arm's length standard. Just as BEPS and country-by-country reporting have been driven by global concern with the strategies employed by multinationals to lower their tax bills, the arm's length standard will be pushed aside by the world's political leaders if the arm's length standard does not produce results that make sense in our modern economy. Finally, a word on the ongoing work on improving mutual agreement procedures. This work is of critical importance because it goes to the heart of a well-functioning international tax system. It is also of critical political importance because policymakers must understand and take into account the importance of providing the appropriate resources to revenue authorities so that they can deal with these cases in an efficient and timely manner. The MAP work outlined in the BEPS deliverables will continue in conjunction with the MAP Forum, part of the Forum on Tax Administration, as I mentioned before, a body in which India participates. A key element of the work will be to set standards for MAP that all countries can agree to, and then to provide for peer reviews so that countries have incentives to become compliant with the emerging standards. As we look forward, MAP must focus on three important areas: timeliness, transparency, and taxpayer input. And we need the help of the Indian government to push these concepts forward. Governments need to set specific goals for the time in which cases will be resolved. There must be transparency with respect to each country's track record in meeting its commitments. And finally, there must be a meaningful avenue for ongoing taxpayer input as to how they perceive countries' progress in connection with MAP. Governments, including the Indian government, should welcome these principles, as they are not aimed at pointing fingers or shaming countries, but rather at improving the quality and speed of dispute resolution around the world. Only by building a strong political foundation for improving dispute resolution can we start down the road of progress, and only by holding ourselves accountable can we advance along that road. We look forward to India's support in building a robust mechanism for improving mutual agreement procedures around the world. So where do we go from here? In preparing for this speech, I was struck by two quotes. When Finance Minister Jaitley announced last September that he was accepting the recommendations of the AP Shah Committee that the MAT provisions do not apply retrospectively to foreign institutional investors prior to April 1, 2015, the president of the U.S.-India Business Council, Mukesh Aghi, explained, quote, "This announcement demonstrates the government of India's commitment to attracting long-term investment into the country by providing greater tax certainty and ease of doing business for the global investment community," close quote. And recently, Amitabh Kant, the Secretary for India's Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, was quoted in the Washington Post as explaining that Prime Minister Modi and Finance Minister Jaitley, quote, "have stated very clearly that there will be predictability and consistency in the tax policy," close quote. These quotes point us to the work ahead. How do we help the world's developing countries and emerging economies balance the pressing need for domestic resource mobilization with the equally pressing need to avoid the sort of uncertainty that inhibits investment and cross-border flows? We need to move this issue forward in the G20 to better identify the dimensions of tax certainty, including the identification of the factors that create uncertainty for investors, as well as searching for acceptable means to reduce uncertainty. This work could lead to recommendations that will reduce uncertainty and also identify best practices to be taken up by countries. It will be important in this work to consult with responsible business leaders on the drivers of uncertainty and to include them in the process. We are working with China, the current G20 president, and Germany, the next, to bring this work forward. And we are hopeful that the G20, with the help of the OECD, can make an important contribution in helping countries navigate these waters. But an agenda that focuses on tax certainty must be accompanied by a commitment on the part of the countries where multinationals are resident to accept rules that reduce the ability of their multinationals to strip income off into tax havens out of developing and emerging economies. President Obama's minimum tax proposal would let companies repatriate income earned in jurisdictions with a tax rate higher than the minimum tax rate without any further U.S. tax on repatriation. Simplified somewhat, income earned in low tax jurisdictions would be taxed in the U.S. at a rate equal to the difference between the minimum tax rate and the rate charged in the local jurisdiction. Such an approach reduces significantly the incentive to shift income out of the U.S., while at the same time vastly reducing the incentive to shift income from developing and emerging economies into tax havens. Approaches such as this, if broadly adopted, would bring a degree of stability to the international tax system and would increase the likelihood that developing and emerging economies could increase certainty and predictability in their tax systems without being overly concerned that the system is stacked against them and that vast sums are flowing into tax haven. The U.S. was deeply disappointed that countries seeking short-term financial advantage thwarted efforts in the BEPS process to more broadly promote concepts such as the minimum tax or controlled foreign corporation rules. This was all the more disconcerting since the BEPS project was sold to the world in part on the basis that it was needed to help developing and emerging economies. We need to keep concepts like the minimum tax and strong CFC rules on the global agenda. The EU's recently proposed package for tackling tax avoidance includes both proposals for CFC rules, as well as so-called switchover proposal that would turn off participation exemptions for low-taxed income. While all of this needs careful scrutiny to determine their effects on developing countries, these are important steps in the right direction. And we hope the world embraces approaches like this because they enhance the stability of the international tax system, reduce stripping out of the residence countries, but very importantly, protect developing and emerging economies. In closing, let me reiterate what a privilege and pleasure it has been to have visited your great country, to have learned from your fine tax officials, and to engage regularly with them on the great tax issues of our day. There is a long road ahead, but I believe both countries are capable of great progress. The lives and economic well-being of our respective citizens are dependent on it, and we owe them all the effort we can muster to improve their lives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Stack. I think you raised a lot of points, and I think you've really been quite straight, minced no words, and really that's been a great speech to hear from you, Mr. Stack. I request Sameer to put a few questions to you, and then I'll close this with a couple of questions of my own.
Right, Arun, and that's true, Bob. You covered very exhaustive analysis at India, BAPS, and MAP, and in just 15-20 minutes. I'm very pleased to hear, being an Indian, Bob, that India being considered as one of the top investment destinations for the world, and especially for US.
Absolutely.
And more pleasing to hear the expanding trade and tax relationship between US and India going forward. And you rightly mentioned it's based on mutual respect.
Absolutely.
And consultative process. And one remark which you made, which just struck me, Bob, one can of course agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Is also an agreement by itself. Let me go back on BAPS, Bob. How do you visualize, I mean, BAPS is here now and it's here to stay. How do you visualize post-BAPS world, both in international tax and transfer pricing from taxpayers as well as tax authorities' perspective, say in near 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think right away we're going to see action across the world on the minimum standards in the BEPS process. I think we're going to see, and we're already seeing, country by country broadly adopted. I think we're going to see the treaty abuse provisions broadly adopted around the world. I believe that the harmful tax work, which is a minimum standard, will also is most important in the area where governments exchange rulings that might have given benefits to certain companies, so that other countries can share them as well. So I think, and obviously I think the work on dispute resolution will advance. So in the short term, I think we're going to see everybody working to implement the minimum standards. There's other parts of BEPS that, while not minimum standards, I also think will have very quick impact. I believe countries will move on the interest limitation work because it's an important part of stripping. I think the hybrid work will get adopted, and I think that the transfer pricing work will have effect very quickly on moving the ability to simply locate profits in entities with low activity. So I think in those two areas we're going to see it. And I think including the developing countries in the inclusive framework, it's yet to see how that will have ripple effects, but I expect that it will.
Right. You referred to country by country, Bob, and in fact that was one of the questions many from this audience would ask when US is going to introduce CBC, and you in fact did cover it in your opening remarks by 30th June, and it will be applicable from 1st of July. One of the two apprehensions the taxpayers have around the world, Bob, and I think take your thoughts on that. One is on confidentiality of the information being shared. There may be some proprietary information, and taxpayers around the world are a bit concerned on how this will be remain confidential within, say, tax authorities at a very highest level. Your thoughts there?
Well, sure. First of all, I think the world needs to understand that countries like India deal with taxpayer information all the time in audits and various fora, number one. Number two, I think that the bargain here on country by country requires both confidentiality and that it's used for the right purposes. And the Indian government is fully aware that if as are all governments, that if this information is not kept confidential, they will stop receiving it in the mechanism that we have set up for it. And as I pointed out in my remarks, the Indian government is already, as I understand it, taking steps to be sure that it can be used for high-level risk assessment and used at the appropriate levels within the Indian government. So I think all directions point in a positive way there.
Mr. Stack, Arunya, any one advice that you'd like to give to all the CFOs and tax heads who are listening to you? What would be the advice you'd like to give to the boardroom across the world, over the next 3 to 5 years? What should they be doing?
Thank you. I think the advice I'd give the boardrooms is get behind international tax reforms around the world that stabilize the system. If we continue down a path of leaving loopholes that can get income sucked off into tax havens, this will not stand political scrutiny, and we will continue to see disruptions and erosion of the stability for investors and countries. So my word is, let's get around building stability. I pointed out the CFC rules and min-tax approaches that can help do that. But I think for companies, there needs to be a focus on the kind of certainty in the stability of the system so countries can focus on giving investors certainty. So I think it's a two-way street.
Yeah, with regards to, the next couple of years, let's do some crystal ball gazing. You're going to see many countries implement BEPS. You're going to have countries like India with domestic legislation. You've already seen the equalization levy equivalent to the digital tax, which has been introduced by the finance minister in the budget a few days ago. Many countries are going to do that. Some of them have already done that. When countries seek to do that, do you see in the initial stages a chaotic post-BEPS world, when at least in the first stages of implementation, or do you think it will be reasonably smooth?
Well, I think a couple of remarks. First, on the equalization tax, I'm aware of it. I haven't been able to study it sufficiently to have a view on it yet. There's no question that there's hunger in the world to be able to increasingly tax the digital economy work, and that's something we will look at. Obviously, India is a sovereign country, and we need to look at it taking that into account as well. Look, I think there's a widespread belief that we are headed towards a period of increased controversy because, for example, the PE rules have been loosened up in ways that may increase controversy. The principal purpose test that will be included in treaties I think will have a potential for increasing controversy. And let's face it, the government's need for resources is not going down anytime soon, which is why we've pointed to the importance of things like MAP and also the importance of getting the G20 to focus in on these questions of how do you do both, collect domestic resources, but at the same time provide an environment of certainty and predictability for taxpayers. So that there needs to be a combined approach so that we don't simply fall into a chaotic and uncertain period.
Right, Bob, and just on that point, we have equalization levy in India, and earlier we have seen UK had diverted profit tax, Australia had multinational anti-avoidance law, and after introduction of BEPS also we feel that for some years there may be disputes. So from a stateless income we may move to multi-taxation, double taxation in many countries. While there are dispute resolution mechanisms, as you explained, on maps, on timelines, transparency, tax per dispute, but you think you refer to G20 inclusive process, Bob. You think are we also moving to a kind of, we have WTO for custom duty disputes? You think we are moving to a dispute settlement body like World WTO, like World Tax Organization? In near future, you think that where we are leading today?
I don't see any evidence of that. I think you're pointing out the fact that some countries have moved beyond anything envisioned by BEPS or current international standards is important. But in my crystal ball, I don't see further and future organizations like a tax organization to deal with these issues. But it's certainly something that as time goes on, people may revisit.
Right. We have just from a back to US, Bob, and a lot of press reports on corporate inversions in US in last few months. You think our post-BEPS world, and I think even US is taking some measures to kind of curb or reduce the inversions going in future?
Well, three things on that. First, I believe that if we're successful in the United States on reforming our international tax system, we will reduce the pressure on inversions. The president would like to lower the corporate income tax rate in the United States. He would also like to broaden the base so we can lower the rate. And we need to take measures to protect against companies, foreign-owned companies, being able to strip income out of the U.S. The Treasury Department has taken executive action that it could with respect to inversions, and the Secretary of the Treasury has called on Congress to help us with that as well. So I would just say I think the inversion story is an ongoing story, and the culmination will be when we do a better job in our international tax system and reduce the ability of non-U.S. companies to strip income out of the U.S.
Right. Just last query before I come at the end, Bob. While Section 1 to 15 is mainly from, as the name suggests, base erosion and profit shifting, it's mainly to, say, protect revenue base of the tax jurisdictions or tax authorities. There was a talk that we should have Section 16 for taxpayer rights, because Section 1 to 15, everywhere it's like tax, there is increasing compliance, there is a profit shifting, treaty abuse, but is there something we should talk about taxpayer rights as well?
Well, I think that one of the themes I was trying to address in my talk was the need to be sure that taxpayers around the world are treated fairly and that traditions such as the rule of law prevail over traditions such as the need to maximize revenue. Because that's the only way, A, to treat taxpayers fairly, and B, to really create the economic growth we need in these countries. Countries are still sovereign, and therefore they need to look at these issues themselves in terms of their own interests in increasing investment and their own traditions with respect to rule of law, democracy, etc. And I think that's a path India is on, and I think taxpayers should be involved in our process going forward in thinking through how to do what we're trying to do in the best ways possible.
Right. Maybe Arun, I will ask a personal question to Bob. Bob, I know you are a New Yorker and being a student of French in your school and college days. Can you briefly explain your journey from a French student to a eminent tax practitioner and a lawyer?
It's, you know, the older I get, the more I realize how serendipitous life can be, and I guess I'm an example of that. The short answer is I started as a young kid with a love of French, and I followed it my entire academic career. And somewhere along the line, when I became a lawyer, I also serendipitously was asked to take a look at tax law. And when I did, because of my love of French, and not just French, but travel and international relations, which is why I've enjoyed so much coming to India, I gravitated towards anything in tax that was international. So basically, my love of French took me into my love of things international, which is kind of why I'm sitting here today and very happy about it.
Right. Yeah. I think with that, Arun, as Bob mentioned, he loves travel and loves to travel to India. So, Bob, we'll take a promise that next year, Arms Length Summit in 2017, we want you to be here, personally present, not on VC.
I'm sure he's giving that word today. Thank you so much, Mr. Stack, for your time. Really wonderful speaking to you. And once again, I must reiterate that you've been a straight talker, the straight talk express, if we may call.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thanks. Bye.
Are we good?
Yeah. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.